to connect a kind of privacy, what she calls a privacy gradient, right through from metropolitan space through to the bedrooms. And in all of that, so the point of the paper that I wrote was that there's something happening in our cities, the way that spaces are designed. There's some interesting changes happening, and that in certain kinds of relationships, or certain kinds of relationships between these different spaces, or these spaces that have abrupt changes in them, are starting to disappear. That's the point of this void thing over here. You'll recognize what these things are here. This is kind of neighborhood in the inner city. This is a neighborhood in the suburbs, say. And we understand already, I think, that there's quite different spaces to these things. What I was proposing here is some kind of reason for that. I'm not going to dwell on that now because I want to push forward because there's a lot more to say. So that in the end, what we're talking about, or we can talk about when we start talking about the form of the city, we can start talking, in my view, about these kind of cultural issues, because what we find are some quite interesting correlations between the model, let's say, and how the model kind of articulates space, and how we start to see space being expressed in the city, and especially how we start seeing it being used. The difference, for example, between that thing and that thing. We can start to understand by starting to understand these kinds of relationships and the, as I say, the relationships between different spaces. Now, I know I'm skimming this here, but here, for example, is a space in the 19th century belt in Amsterdam, and here's another diagram that I did of it. What we're kind of talking about here is the way that somebody can, in one of these spaces, be part of two spaces at the same time. Now, the diagram on the top there is meant to represent somebody, say, this person walking on the corner here, in a neighborhood in Amsterdam where he's on that supergrid, in other words, where the trams goes, in other words, the most busy spaces, where all the shops are, the most visible spaces, and he's part of the neighborhood as well. Okay, he's part of the neighborhood on the one hand. He's part of this white grid up here. But then when we zoom out, and the red grid up there is the same as the red grid here, he's also part of the city space. You can get on a tram at the same time and so on. So it's about these conjunctions between two different spaces which operate and are perceptual frames for understanding and being in the city at different scales, where these two things start to overlap. So you can see how somebody might be in the neighborhood and in the city at the same time when they're on that red street there, for example. So these kinds of relationships start to be the kind of issue, and what's kind of the kind of conceptual idea behind all of this is that there's these, as I say, kind of perceptual fields that we live in and we're part of, and that there's an horizon to the way that we, to the extent that we understand the city when we're part of the neighborhood, for example, like when we look at the map at this scale here. And then when we zoom out, we suddenly can become part of the city and become, part of the. There can be this incredibly intimate relationship between these two scales. That was just the start. From there, I started thinking, okay, it works like that at the neighborhood scale. And as I say, I wrote this paper about it, which needs revision, and I must go back to it. But we looked at that scale. What about the rest of it? And what about the metropolitan scale? What about the global scale? Are all of these other things, or is there some kind of way of connecting what we've learned here to all of these other kinds of understandings as well? Firstly, I'll just show you So anyway, that's just kind of finishing off that set, if you like, there, and just showing you that the possibility of going further might exist. I'm just showing you some of the correlations here, correlation with retail, and we start to see the patterns of very, very local retail, for example, and what Kerat actually drew against it. You don't see it. I've got a nice pattern of small streets here, but you don't see it there. It's a very, very fine mesh of white streets in that map there. Can you see the streets here? Yes, you can. Okay. And this is looking at it at another scale, and what we're talking about here is a different kind of shop. When we were looking at this one here, we were looking at things like tobacconists, news agents, things like that, places which have clearly a local kind of function. And when we're looking at shops at this scale, what we're looking at are things like the Blocker, things like the Hammer, things which are sort of neighborhood scale shops, where people might also come in from different parts of the city to use it. And we started extending outwards then and started thinking about global space and metropolitan space. And started indeed getting some kind of correlation between these orange, again the color's gone strange here. This is red here, mostly red. That's red there as well. That's supposed to be orange. That's supposed to be orange. That's supposed to be orange. Orange is kind of metropolitan stuff. It's things that are really kind of significant and have a meaning, let's say, at the metropolitan scale. I won't have time to go into all of this, unfortunately, but there's another concept which we developed called the object world, which says that things which are part of these different perceptual meanings actually, are intrinsic to that perceptual field, that we understand them as what they are due to their contextualization. So, for example, at the local scale, we'll see local things, and these things are contextualized in a local environment. At the larger scale, we'll see larger scale things and so on. And that the things themselves, the object, are dependent on the worlds in which we find them. It's a what do you call it, phenomenological idea, which I developed. There's a strong correlation as well with history. I've just taken a little snippet out of London here. You'll see immediately, like there's a kind of flatness about this. We can't read anything about it. But as soon as we start putting other layers of, we talked about streets in Amsterdam. Well, here's the metro in London. Once we start talking about those things, we start to see, in fact, that there's much, much more going on in this area than is apparent in the first instance from the map. But these other kinds of spaces, or these other kinds of, where we talked about different kinds of spaces as streets before, we might be able to talk about them in the metro, in terms of the metro as well. And when we start to look at, for example, the intensities going on there, this is a very nice map which was done with GPS systems. This is all the deliveries in London maps on, because all the delivery vans have GPS systems, and somebody just took some of their data and drew a map of London with that. And there's a very clear kind of pattern in there about the intensity of use. And we find, again, that there's an enormous correlation with something we didn't really kind of expect to be so intimately correlated. It's a kind of surprising. There's something